Welcome to Community Liberation Podcast, a podcast about applying revolutionary theory to revolutionary practice. My name is Silvia, and I'm an organizer from Community Liberation Programs, or CLP. CLP is a multinational scientific socialist mass organization based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We currently run decolonization programs in Oakland and San Francisco, such as our Oakland Chinatown grocery distribution, our San Francisco Youth Street Medic program, and our Mission District program. We also regularly hold public political education events and classes. To learn more about our programs, you can follow us on Instagram at Community Liberation Programs, and you can support our Buymeacoffee and Give Butter in the show notes. This podcast and other decolonization programs for the people are 100% funded by grassroots donations like yours. So, welcome to episode 3 of Community Liberation Podcasts. Today, we're joined by CLP's co-founders, Danielle and Rafiq, and we're going to go over who Community Liberation Programs is and what we do. We'll be discussing how CLP started and the growth we've made in the past 5 years. CLP would not be here without the hard work and dedication that Danielle and Rafiq have put into it. So, Danielle and Rafiq, do you want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. Do you want to go first, Rafiq?
Yeah. Hi, Silvia. Thanks for having us. My name is Rafiq Ali. I one of the co-founders of CLP and one of the heads of our program here in San Francisco. I was one of the people who was there when CLP was founded in 2020, which I'm sure we'll sort of get into. In addition to my role leading the San Francisco chapter, I've also contributed quite a bit to our internal political education, our external political education events, and quite a bit to our original programs out in the East Bay and Hayward and Union City.
Cool. Yeah, and I'm Danielle. Similarly, been there since the beginning. I currently help co-lead the San Francisco chapter, although currently I am taking a little bit of a step back while I'm in school. Hopefully in the next year, get back into it. But prior to starting school again, I was helping leading our social media group, and similarly with some political education. And again, with our East Bay programs at the beginning.
Yeah, thanks for introducing yourselves. Danielle and Rafiq were some of the first people I met in CLP when I started volunteering around 4 years ago. So we'll get into how they started the organization with our first question is how/why did y'all start organizing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's hard to talk about that without talking about sort of the political journey that sort of underwrites what drives a person to take action in their community and to take political action in a sort of serious and disciplined way. So I'll speak for myself in terms of that. So yeah, originally my national background is Iranian. Like I'm a very proud Iranian and have been pretty much my whole life. Um, and growing up, most of my dad's side of the family is here in the States, split between a few places, but largely like centered around San Jose and like the South Bay, where most of my family is based. And growing up in the United States, during the time period that I did, was pretty traumatic for like a young sort of Middle Eastern kid, not sort of, but a young Middle Eastern kid, during the war on terror, right? So from a pretty young age, there was this ingrained understanding that I was not an American. I was not the same as people who were Euro Americans essentially. Like that concept of race was something that was pretty ingrained in me from a young age. In addition to that, observed a lot of just suffering that members of my family were going through, whether it was immigration related, economic exploitation, different things that were happening within my extended family. And I was really fortunate that I grew up in a very political family. Like from a young age, we grew up with political conversations around the dinner table. I had the kind of family where you were in the house by the time the lights were off on the street and you were having dinner as a family, and had parents who made it an effort to really challenge us politically and force us to think about things on a deeper level. My parents generally are secular nationalists, very pro-Iran, but at the same time, not terribly religious themselves. And I was fortunate also to have people in like my local Iranian community who were pretty good about putting material in front of me that shaped my political development. So there was two books that like I think at a young age like I was exposed to that helped me sort of like develop an early sort of anti-imperialist like lens. One was All the Shah's Men by Stephen Kinzer, which outlines the 1953 coup against Mohammad Mossadegh in Tehran, which was headed by the CIA and British intelligence services, and removed Iran's democratically elected nationalist leader and replaced it with the man that we all know as like the Shah of Iran, Shah Pahlavi. Um, and another one was a book also by Stephen Kinzer called Overthrow, which like uh, outlined the overthrow of like different governments that the United States had taken part in, starting with Hawaii in the late 19th century and running all the way up until the modern day with, or at the time modern day with the Iraq War. And obviously, there's been a few more since then. So from a young age, like I had a very sort of like anti-imperialist mindset, and I would say it was a little bit maybe of like liberal anti-imperialism in the sense that I viewed it as like a policy decision undertaken by like the Bush administration, driven by these like cartoon characters like Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney. And, that drove me at a young age to be pretty involved in politics, I guess like electoral politics. And, when I was, I think around 12 years old, it was the first Obama campaign in 2007, 2008. And I sort of dove headfirst. I was like, mom and dad, I want to go volunteer. I think this is right. Like, I sort of looked at it and I fell for the what I now recognize as like a neo-colonial trick. But like, here's this guy whose middle name is Hussein, like, who, was campaigning very much as like an anti-war, anti-foreign intervention candidate. And that's was, it's hard to remember now, but like back in the day, that was like the main thing that sort of propelled Barack Obama like within the Democratic Party and like built his sort of mass base. And after Obama was elected, actually, let me mention like even during his like sort of election campaign, I volunteered. I actually got to meet Obama at one point, like because I was like a youth volunteer, and I handed him a letter. I remember this like very clearly. I handed him a letter, uh, pleading with him basically to end the blockade on Gaza, which was I think just like a few years old at that point in time. I don't think it was, nowadays like we act like it's always been that way. But the blockade on Gaza actually like I correct me if I'm wrong, started like, less than 5 years before that, like in the early 2000s. Um and so, I was pleaded with him for that, handed him that letter. He thanked me, shook my hand, I felt great about it. He gets elected. I'm jubilant, really feel like things are turning a corner for like racialized people in the country. And, I really identified like, and it was like, some of the first moments where I sort of identified with like the struggles of like Black Americans and like other minority groups in the United States, national minorities. And then I watched, 8 years go by of just the decimation of the Middle East, drone strikes, carpet bombings, the deaths and displacements of millions of people, the fall of Libya, even the early stages of the destruction of Syria, the Arab Spring, like all these things sort of happen. And it challenged like these deeply held beliefs I had about like, what the United States was, what like the goal of liberalism was, like what it actually like purpose it serves in this like political system. And it sort of pushed me to want to understand more. And so, I think by the time I was like late in high school, I was starting to like, on a superficial level, I'll admit now, but I was starting to get interested in like the Cuban Revolution and Fidel and Che, um, and some of the things that were going on like overseas, the Chinese Revolution. I had like, started to like learn a little bit about Mao, but I still wasn't really engaging with the material in like the way that I would consider like serious, like in this day and age. Um, and then when I went off to college, it was that was like at the time of I think it was my second year. It was like the time of the Mike Brown uprising in Ferguson. And Obama once again sends in militarized, tanks and all these things, and you have these Ferguson organizers who are being assassinated. And I think that was like a big sort of like formative moment for me where that was maybe like the final straw of like discarding liberalism and like really believing the United States was like this entity that was like rotten to its core, and that some kind of revolutionary change to the organization of society here was necessary, and not just for like Black people in the United States, but for like my family in Iran, for like people like overseas who were suffering under the brunt of US imperialism. And so I think like at that point in time, I like became more interested. I was really lucky to study in college at one point under the tutelage of somebody who was a student of Cedric Robinson. And so I was exposed to like Black Marxism, Marx, some of these things kind of like upfront. And I would say at the time, I really didn't fully understand what I was reading. You know, it was like that typical thing where somebody's like, oh, I read Fanon in college. And, you know, you talk to them and they maybe didn't drive everything away from the book as like somebody who's like studying it from more of a revolutionary perspective. Um, so I think I was still sort of superficially engaging. I dipped my toes in campus activism at the time. I wrote articles for like the local paper, like at my college. And sort of realized like you know, I was kind of like locked in this mode where I was like, okay, like, you know, I'm a socialist, I'm a communist, I'm something, you know. But I wasn't organizing, I wasn't like closely in touch with the community, you know, I was kind of like isolated on like a very like college towny type of campus. Um and it was just not really a big thing in my life beyond like maybe some like ideological convictions. And I think that's like a statement that I think describes a lot of people. Like I would say the majority of people in my life now, like in 2025, are like somewhere in that stage where they, you know, maybe reject US imperialism or reject these ideas on like a very like theoretical level, but haven't like put that into practice in terms of organizing just yet. I think that all shifted for me during the George Floyd uprising. I think that's sort of like when that uprising happened, seeing what was happening, realizing like, you know, one of the truths of dialectics, which is like nothing can stay the same, like that there is like an expiration date for like every empire, um, made me realize that like if I wasn't the type of person with my like knowledge, my background, and with the resources I had access to like actually like start building a political project of some sort, then nobody would, you know. And that I think is sort of the catalyst for why we decided to form CLP, or at the time, Workers Community Kitchen WCK.
Yeah, thanks for that explanation. It's really interesting to hear about, your political journey. And I think a lot of people can have like similar political journeys at their times in life. I have kind of a similar one in high school. I started learning about things, but didn't really put it to practice until later. But yeah, Danielle, did you want to go over your political journey or like why you started WCK?
Yeah, I guess like I will start saying I was way more ignorant about politics than Rafiq growing up. I grew up in Southern California, in Orange County, in a predominantly white and Asian community. As a kid, I was on my mom's side, Mexican, and she was undocumented for a good chunk of my childhood. I think until I was like 15 is when she got her residency. So that was something that I navigated. Like I remember being so scared to tell my friends things like that, but there's still a disconnect for me of like that fear that I had, but like not connecting it to what the United States is as a project. And then on my dad's side, being Black or New African was also like, yeah, it was just a really interesting, like, way to navigate in the social settings I was. All my friends were white and being very pointedly told, like, you are not like us, but we like you kind of thing. So I developed like this internalized racism basically of like, oh, when people tell me like, oh, I'm acting white, like it's a compliment. And I was totally like, my world was transformed when I went to university. I took a class called Women of Color. I'm like, I think I'm that. Like, let me see what that's all about. And like, it was very basic, but I started getting language and ideas to help explain experiences that I had growing up. And there was a lot of contradictions growing up. Like I mentioned, being told like, oh, you're like an Oreo, and like as a way to kind of survive, I assimilated in like those ideas of like, okay, that is a good thing. But then when I learned like these counter narratives of like, this is something that like a racist society does to perpetuate like oppression in people, and like those who assimilate like um, continue to perpetuate that, was something where I was like, okay, like there's something that I need to continue to learn to further like an understanding of what was going on in society because I'm like, okay, I'm learning something new. There's so much more for me to know. And in college, I would describe myself as like, I would tell people I'm a radical leftist, I'm a communist, but I didn't really do anything. I would consider myself like an online activist, like super deep onto Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, talking all my friends and family's ear off about like racism, like imperialism, but like not really having the doing the work, just like kind of reading things more like academic and similar to what Rafiq was saying, like the George Floyd uprising in 2020 was what really like lit a fire under me where I'm like, okay, I have all this knowledge, like and understandings, and there's a lot of suffering that's going on, especially at that point. It was like peak COVID. And there was a lot of people in our communities that were struggling with food insecurity. So, from there, we just kind of looked at where the gaps were and we're like, okay, like we have knowledge, like, and maybe we'll go into this a little bit more, but it's like we have this knowledge and there's like a gap in what the community needs right now that the state isn't fulfilling. So let's kind of fill in that gap and also do a little bit of political education with some people in our communities. And then from there, like I feel like my learning and understanding just like went up so much with like the people that we were organizing with, and like me now and me 5 years ago, like yes, I called myself like a leftist or a communist then. I don't think I would necessarily call myself those things now. But I definitely consider myself like an anti-imperialist, anti-America kind of thing. So, it's an interesting transition for sure.
Yeah, I definitely feel like CLP is like almost not like completely, but almost a different organization than it was when it was WCK. And like we even, we have a name change. We'll get into that later. And we have different politics like than we did previously, which is like will happen. That's dialectics. So yeah, now that we kind of started talking about WCK, Workers Community Kitchen, what were some of WCK's past programs?
Yeah, so I kind of mentioned it, but initially we started with the food distribution at in Union City area.
Charles F. Kennedy Park.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we started with food distributions there, and I remember, I think, so we started there with like pretty small, and it just kind of grew and grew as we got more interest and the community started learning about it. This was weekly food distributions. Rafiq would cook like 100 meals, and we would also find different avenues to get groceries for people. So they would get a hot meal and like a bag of groceries. That was a lot of work for sure, doing that for every week for almost a year. And then what else? We had our community garden, which we would also distribute food from the community garden there. Our water distribution, where we would distribute water to different encampments in the Fremont Union City area. What else?
Yeah, I think those were the initial programs, but I think it's important to talk about like how those kind of came together. I think especially for like folks who are listening to this podcast, like if there isn't like a organization in your area that is really like advancing a revolutionary anti-imperialist like decolonial politic, then like you're gonna have to make one, right? There's no way around it. Like it's I would suggest myself, and this is coming from like a specific biased point of view since we did the thing. um it's much better to start, and this is maybe paraphrasing even like Fidel Castro a little bit. It's a lot better to start with like a small group of people who have a clear objective of what they're doing than it is to go join like a big tent and to like be funneled into an organization that doesn't align, like a DSA that like has like an incredibly soft spot for Zionism, as we've seen over the last like few years. So like I think it's important to talk about like how that process sort of like sprang up so that people can sort of learn from it. I would say like and the idea kind of first dawned on us that there's like something we could be doing Part of it was that we were seeing like quote unquote mutual aid like happening like in the uprising in like other cities. And even in our own region, like I think we had become aware of like people's programs up in Oakland and
There
like
was one in San Jose.
yeah, it was a group that's I don't know if they're still active anymore, but there was a group in San Jose, and there was this like obviously like it's the Bay Area. There's a lot of like sort of like small political projects, and so it's not like WCK did not obviously invent the idea of like a food distribution like that goes back all the way to the Panthers, right? Potentially before that too. Um, but we had the idea. We had like a small group of friends who like all were like in the region, all like in the South kind of East Bay area around Hayward, Union City, Fremont. And really we saw like a pretty big like gap in the community. And so like, we kind of going through the logistics, like what could we do? What do we have the capacity for? What's like in within our abilities? And I would say like, the COVID shutdown was a big part of that. I think like I was working a remote job and I was like pretty much over it and was blowing it off and, was basically doing the bare minimum and dedicating 60 hours a week based to organizing at the time, which like, not possible like now with like where I'm at in life. But at the time, it was possible. And I think it speaks to like why like young people and students and stuff can be so like, impactful in the movement because like they can really like allow it to be like they don't have as many responsibilities, like to put it another way. But we were kind of saying like, hey, we could go to the restaurant supply store, and during COVID they suspended their membership program, so you can just walk in and buy anything you want. And so I remember we went and bought two big, like gigantic, like stainless steel pots. And every week we would make like, and we would use the oven, and we would make one vegetarian meal, one like non-vegetarian meal, and like a huge pot of beans, and like um,
Rice.
we bought a giant rice cooker, started soliciting donations from our friends and family. We created our like our Instagram page, and just started raising money to do it. We had no idea what we were doing. We really truly like didn't have any idea what we were doing, but we just like felt like we had to do something. I remember like we would work things out like traffic control. Like it was huge. We were serving, and you said 100 meals. It was actually more than that. It was between 80 and 100 of each type of meal. So it was like around 160 to 200 meals at a time. And so as we were doing that, like other groups are reaching out to us, we're meeting people. And, at the time, like during the George Floyd uprisings and COVID shutdowns, like there was a lot of volunteers. Like it was a lot of like young, like people of color, like Latino, Filipino, I think were like the main groups in Union City. Some like Chinese folks, and like there was a lot of like Chinese people at the distributions who only spoke Cantonese, I think. So you were kind of like working through these like very real challenges that like still to this day when you're doing programs you like have to like figure out. And we were building up this like knowledge and this experience and stuff. And as we were meeting other groups, we found out there was people going to encampments, and sometimes we'd have a few leftover meals, so we would like take them home and refrigerate them, heat them up the next day. And then like the kids who were going to the encampments, it was a group called Renegade, and I don't know if they're still active or not, but we would like they would come by our house and like pick up like
The meals,
the
the extra
meals.
meals.
Yeah, and then we started tagging along. We started meeting people in the encampments, like kind of like building up a personal relationship with them. Like we started even like reading some theory with them and talking about politics, and like it was an important experience for us as well. It's like you're learning how to talk about these things, and like you're talking to people who are like generally like very receptive to them compared to like somebody who lives in a paid off suburban house. um just still a lot in the Bay Area. That's a lot of people. Um, and so like, through that we figured out like one of the needs the encampment had was the need for clean water. That was like the first thing both women that were like sort of the encampment leaders that we were like communicating with like communicated to us. It's like, okay, well, like what would it take? Like we could drop off cases of water from Costco. Is that really the most efficient? Like, and I don't remember exactly how we had this connection to a local water store, but basically we like it was a store that basically like people go to fill up those 5 gallon blue water jugs, and they offered us like free refills for that encampment. Really nice people. And I think they were like involved in some kind of like vegan activism at the time, and maybe that was sort of a soft spot that we were able to talk to them about. But I think they were just generally excited to see young people in their community kind of like doing something that was like good for folks, and they didn't have any of that like sort of fascist American like hatred of the unhoused that you see like in a lot of people. So we started setting up regular deliveries. We pick up empty bottles from the encampments. We use the people at the encampments, like the leaders, to kind of like police, for lack of a better term, but to like get people to put their like bottles out, make sure they're clean, make sure they're like sort of like doing it in a way that is like the facilitates like the best sort of like relationship with like the organizers. Um, we like I remember we set up like a commissary. It was like a metal cabinet that we were like leaving supplies in, like people could leave extra things in. Um, and so that was like a pretty interesting experience. And from there, like, the idea of food sovereignty came up and we're like, okay, well, like these are skills that we need to develop. And I think like, we set up our community garden plot. We, started growing produce there. I remember for Iranian New Year in 2021, like I cooked like a huge thing of ghormeh sabzi, which is like the national like stew of Iran. And that was cool. Like we used our own produce to like make that meal, and we were like people were excited about it and talked to us about how good the radishes tasted and how fresh the herbs were that it was like served with. And I think like all of the underlying like all of that, I think like the realization that kind of hit me, at least, I don't know if this was like something everyone thought of, was that like there's only a limit to how much you can learn by reading theory, and there's only a limit to how much you can do like in isolation as a person, as an individual. That like what was really needed at the core of all this was like a group of young people who were dedicated to a continuous process of like political growth and a continuous process of growing revolutionary capacity. I think that was sort of the guiding light that resulted in us being able to survive, where like a lot of our contemporaries at the time like fizzled out after like a year or two, or sometimes less.
Yeah, definitely. I think like a good lesson to learn if you're wanting to start an organization is like it is hard work, like, and it's going to continue to be hard work. So be prepared. Those water jugs, you do get buff though with some type of organizing because like I was able to hold like two water jugs at one time. I got up to that level of strength, so that was pretty great. And some of our other past programs we also had a distribution at People's Park. So I think that was in 2021. We recruited a bit of UC Berkeley students and they saw People's Park as a place to organize. Again, it was kind of, I would say like WCK era, like the theme of that wasn't really like putting in a lot of social investigation and figuring out what we need to do. It was more like, okay, we know of this place. Let's go there and let's just set up a table and hand out food or hand out supplies. So that's kind of what we did at People's Park. We did hand out like PPE, we handed out hot meals at times and just different groceries, hygiene kits, etc., that we would get free from places in Berkeley and utilize those resources. So that was another one of like our programs under WCK into the transition to CLP. But to get more into like WCK, and we already kind of talked about this a little bit, but what were some of the challenges that came with organizing as WCK?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, Rafiq, you hit a few. The big thing I think, kind of looking back at it, was that lack of social investigation, I think, where we talked about the water distribution as an example. And I think one thing that comes to mind there is at one point we attempted to do water distributions at two different encampments, which initially we had a really good relationship, or we had a really good relationship with the first encampment that we were doing that with or collaborating with. And then, as Rafiq was mentioning, we were working a lot with Renegade Feedings. That was the organization that went out to different encampments. And we went to this additional encampment in Newark, I think it was. And similarly, they mentioned the need for water, and we decided to move forward with it without really looking into the differences in logistics between the encampment that we had been working with at Quarry Lakes, versus the encampment in Newark. And I think at some point, like, we just did not have the right labor capacity. It was like, for me personally, what I learned from that is like, you need to ensure that you have the right amount of labor prior to promising people in the community that you're going to do something, because yeah, it's just like overextending yourselves and also disappointing the people in the community when you aren't able to uphold that promise. And then it kind of creates maybe a sense of disillusion, like with the people in the community. I don't know, Rafiq, if there's something that comes to mind with you about this as well.
Yeah, on that specific note, I think it's like momentum is like a big thing, and it's like you want to create the impression among your community and among your volunteers and your members that like things are growing, things are like, dialectically in a process of like growth and enhancement and like strengthening. And the thing is with organizing, it's not always going to be that way. Like you're going to have to retreat at points, you're going to have to, realize errors and go back. But I think at that point in time, yeah, we like, basically felt like we could do anything, and like it was that moment. I think it was part of that moment in time of 2020 also where the possibilities just seemed so endless that we were like, yeah, we could start a farm, we could start serving 4 different encampments, we could um do all sorts of things like that, right? And I think that was like a big challenge for sure. And I think like the theme that I would say, it's like political underdevelopment and like just underdevelopment as organizers in general. And I'll give a few sort of examples. I think when we started WCK, like we mentioned our own like political journeys, and I would say like even among the people that started WCK, like most people were either in our situation or even like a little less developed, and was like, it's a good thing for us to do while we're under lockdown. It gets us out, we can see people. And I think that was like the first sort of, I don't want to call it a mistake because obviously we like built something that survived, but that was the first contradiction, was that we weren't all on the same page about what it is that we were doing. I think within the first few months, like at least Danielle and I know at least like 1 or 2 other people in the group realized that what we were trying to build was like a long-term political project, while others maybe thought of it as more of like a short-term community service project. And those are 2 like extremely different like things. And so you're already like, you have disunity at that point in time. Um, and I think the other like aspect of political underdevelopment was like, we were getting so much interest from these volunteers and these people who they had family that was coming to the program, or they like, like they were like members of the community who like were tapping in because they saw something that was like vibrant and like, interesting. And our lack of political development meant that we were like unable to fully politicize those early volunteers and to really turn them into like hardcore long-term revolutionaries. And I think like the first volunteers who actually like became that were like actually you, Silvia, and like other people that joined the organization around that time. And I think that speaks, and that was, I think, like spring of 2021, if I remember correctly. It was almost a year after we started CLP in August of 2020.
And I also want to add, at that point, we started doing internal political education in the organization.
Yeah. And I think, like, I think it's important to talk about that. Like, how did the political development of CLP/WCK actually like happen? It was, I think like as we were getting into our practice, as we were like, building up these programs and stuff in the fall of 2020, I realized I was like, I really am operating from a position of political underdevelopment, and it's a disservice to the people that I'm organizing with that I haven't put as much energy into reading, into like, studying as I could have originally. And so like, I think at that time I started just like going in on the reading. I was probably reading on average like around 80 to 100 pages a day. Marx, Lenin, Mao, Fanon. I was basically, I think I was like finding old reading lists from the Black Panther Party, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna speed run every single book that a Black Panther Party member would have had to read in the 60s and 70s, or the 70s, and like I'm gonna do it all in like 3 months, and I did. I like read everything I possibly could. And then we there was 2 other kind of things that happened. Like, yeah, we started our internal reading groups.
You also joined one, right?
I did. So and I think this is like an important thing to mention when it comes to like how did we overcome this challenge? Like how did we resolve this contradiction? At the time in early 2021, one of our local Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Army alumni, Jalil Muntaqim, was released from prison. And one of his family members, a boss, was like one of the leaders of people's programs, and had like posted like, yeah, we're doing this like study group, like it's online, like Jalil's out, he's going to be talking about his book, We Are On Liberators. And so I joined, and it was it was a really interesting study group, and it just challenged a lot of ideas that I had at the time. And I think even at that point in time, I had like adopted like the term Marxist Leninist to describe like my general political and socio-political like outlook.
Mhm.
And Jalil like challenged that over and over and over again, in his class. And so that was like a huge sort of like growing moment for me. And at the same time, I was like, okay, well, I feel like I've built up a base. I feel like I sort of like understand these concepts well enough. And there's a lot of like uneducated people who are like make these very like grandiose statements about the movement and what they should or shouldn't be doing. And I should start growing my political education skills. So we originally like we started like a class for other organizers in our area that was like Socialism 101. That's what we
Yeah.
called it.
I thought we also called it like the workers community classroom.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. And so, I won't go too far into that because I think we'll talk a little bit more about like the political ideology shifts that have happened in the last 5 years. But it's that relationship between theory and practice that I think really, once we internalized it and drove it forward, that like propelled our development. And at a certain point, like I think it, CLP. We'll talk a little about like I think the transition from WCK to CLP and some of the contradictions, but I think that original contradiction I mentioned about people having different ideas about what the organization was at the get go was the driving force behind like the tumultuous like transformation of WCK to CLP.
Yeah, definitely. I think We Are Own Liberators was definitely a turning point text for CLP. I mean, I read it almost right immediately coming into the organization. I think it was like that summer after we joined. And yeah, I don't think I would have joined without the internal like political education and reading groups that y'all put on. So that was definitely, an important shift that we had to make as an organization. So the next question is, what was the transition like from WCK to CLP, and what was the reason for the name change?
Yeah, I mean, the transition I think was somewhat difficult. Like Rafiq had mentioned, there was different ideas of what WCK was. Like, for example, there was like differences in opinion in regard to like even acknowledging like the Republic of New Africa as an example, just because again, we were all so at different places in our political development. So like eventually people um decided that it it just didn't match with like what they wanted to do more long term. So like a big chunk of the people who were like in leadership of the organization ended up leaving, which was really stressful because it's like, okay, we have some of these programs, like we don't have the labor, what do we do? So at some point, I think we just kind of like decided to pause on some things. Like at that point, were we still doing the community garden? And I don't remember at that point.
Yeah, we had the community garden going still.
Yeah,
We had paused the food distribution because both like we had shifts in labor. So I think like, like myself, I was like
we had moved
moving.
to San Francisco. We were
Yeah,
moving to San Francisco, so like at that point, I think.
that's right. But we still had the garden going. Yeah. And I think like the point that you're kind of getting at maybe is like there was a sort of a crisis in CLP. It's like you have programs that are dying, you have like um, you know, people who maybe thought it was just like this like fun short-term community service project that were, that type of like joy can only push you so long without sort of like that revolutionary motivation at the bottom to like kind of push you through the grind. And I think that had like worn on those individuals. And so we were kind of like at this like major turning point for the organization. The other thing that sort of happened is like we had recruited or drawn interest from like another group of like revolutionaries in the
Mm.
East Bay who were at the time like members of the Party for Reclamation and Survival, which is I think no longer active. Um, and to their credit, like instead of starting their own like sort of like service to the people programs or like survival programs or decolonization programs, they decided they needed to tap in with people who are sort of already on the ground in the community. And so that partnership kind of was cultivated, and those members ended up joining WCK/CLP. And so we had this influx of like people with a bit more political development than like the people who had left the organization at that time. I think that was like sort of the catalyst of like, okay, we're looking at what we're doing. Certain things have not worked, certain things have worked. since when we started, we were these like generic kind of socialists, or like if you even want to call us that, like liberal socialists. I don't know like what the best way to put it is.
Underdeveloped.
Underdeveloped, yeah, underdeveloped. Let's take a comprehensive look based off of We Are Own Liberators, based off of like these texts that we've written. Like, let's take all the theory that we've studied for the last, year, or year and a half at that point. I'm trying to
It
remember.
was a year
Yeah,
because we started our food distributions in June of 20 or August of 2020, I think it was. And at that point, it was, yeah, about August of 2021.
2021. Yeah. Let's do like a comprehensive like restructuring the organization. So I remember, if you read We Are Our Liberators, there's like he basically has like this like guidebook, and I invite everyone listening to this podcast, go read We Are Our Own Liberators. Like, turn the podcast off right now and go read it. No, but finish the podcast first. But seriously, go read We Are Our Own Liberators and engage with Jalil Muntaqim's work, because he gives you like a step by step of like what like a group of cadre in a given community should do as they formulate like a political program. And we had skipped all these things when we created WCK, and that's what had led to these contradictions.
Yeah.
And it was studying like the conditions of the community, the history of the land, the different classes, their relationship, like all these things. Like you're really doing like a from scratch study of these things and developing theories for how like the current social reality was created. Like reconciling with concepts of settler colonialism, the history of California, the history of the Bay, the repression of like the New Left, the repression of the Black Panther Party, like all these things kind of baked into our analysis. And I remember we created this like document that was like,
Yeah.
this is our analysis of our like political conditions, our ideology. And we basically created all of that from scratch and put those politics into command in structuring a new organization or a transformation of the organization that would be like better positioned to grow and create revolutionaries and build up like this type of like organizing infrastructure in our communities.
Yeah. And I think like at that point, like workers' community kitchen just didn't really make much sense. Like we weren't a kitchen. We weren't really like cooking for people. The grocery distribution had ended. Also having like workers in the name kind of makes us sound like we're trots. So we were like, okay, maybe we shouldn't have that in the name either. But we were like community, like we like community is a good word and we want to keep that. So it was kind of like a lot of different meetings going through different variations of names with community in them. And then we settled on community liberation programs because of We Are Own Liberators and programs. We wanted to have decolonization programs, and we kind of started to realize what decolonization programs are, like separate from survival programs, but they're built off of survival programs. And we're not just doing like mutual aid. That was another thing. Like we kind of started out as a quote unquote mutual aid organization. And we grew from that and we started developing new programs. So I guess we'll get into that a little bit more. The next question: how has CLP's political ideology shifted in the past 5 years?
Yeah, I think like one thing I'll add, I think just like it touches on this question also, maybe on the last question, is like you can start to understand it even in the name change of WCK to CLP. It's this focus from like this concept of like Marxist workers revolution, of like the
Like
class struggle, and like this like revolution of the workers and proletariat over like the capitalists. And the name change to community liberation programs, I think, was like the big shift there. And this is like, I think, central to understanding how our political ideology shifted, was this focus on national liberation as like the motive, like primary thing that organizing should be focused on, is like the national liberation of like oppressed peoples.
Yeah, oppressed people, the global south. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's wonderfully said. Yeah, because I think us going into it kind of like we were saying, viewing ourselves as like Marxist Leninists. And that can be seen where I think I remember also when we were planning like workers community kitchen, similarly how we were going over our name change, like, oh, what makes sense? Like, okay, we want workers, like people will see, like we will attract certain people. Like that was just what we were thinking. We will attract certain people if we name ourselves workers community kitchen. This highlights something specifically. And then after our internal political education, realizing like not necessarily that that wasn't the group of people that we were trying to get into the organization, but it wasn't true to this new political ideology that we had internalized at that point.
Yeah, definitely. And there's also a whole other topic you can talk about, like what is working class, like in the United States, and like the different class dynamics, just even within the Bay Area as a whole, too. So, yeah, I think CLP's political ideology has shifted. And we also kind of stopped using the term Marxist Leninist as well, just to not like what's the word, like attract just like one type of person, because there's so many different ways people identify themselves as like politically, and we didn't want to kind of just create like a vacuum and just have like people who are maybe like traditional Marxists come into the organization. And we wanted to invite like people who see more of like a national liberation struggle and like think more dialectically about how things have changed over time. So yeah, I don't know if y'all wanted to get more into that or.
No, I think you make a really great point. I think like if you want to like think about what's the hallmark of this like political shift in CLP over the last 5 years, it's this rejection of dogmatism. Like early on, you're just really orthodox, Marxist Leninist, like, and you start studying these revolutions in Algeria, these revolutions in these other countries, and you can't like bring yourself to reject like the revolutions of like colonized people against world imperialism and world capitalism just because like they're not flying the big red flag with the hammer and sickle on it or the big red flag with all the yellow stars on it. Like that was, I think, one of the big things that shifted. And like I think I'll speak for myself even like over the last 5 years, like as an Iranian, like the assassination of Qasem Soleimani was like a huge kind of moment for me. And even prior to that, I talked about this in like our Iran panel, but like I had traveled, a bit before like the pandemic in like the Islamic world and like Morocco, the Middle East, and like some other places, and um, meeting like working class or like oppressed Muslims in those countries, and like the reaction that I would get when people would like learn that I was Iranian was like something that really made me like reconsider my preconceived notions of like my home country. And at the time, like I wasn't quite at the level of like one of these like Irvine Shah supporters or whatever, like that you're gonna, you hear about when people say listen to Iranian voices. But I thought like that it was like an Islamic regime. Like it'd be better if we had a socialist government. It would be better if like the workers of Iran rose up and like created a new anti-imperialist Iran. And I even believed like some of the mythology or like the imperialist like mythology around like Iran's actions in like Syria and Iraq, and like this concept of like Iranian imperialism, like that was like it's almost ridiculous to like say out loud. And I think both through study, both through travel, and then both through like not both, but also through my like my own like development like religiously, and like my relationship to Islam, and like my deeper study of like Iranian thinkers like Ali Shariati and Jalal Alimad, and like all these ideologues of like the Iranian Revolution. Like I think that was a big moment in like me personally rejecting like the dogmatism of Marxism Leninism. I think you can even see it in the way like CLP is organized. Like I'll point to something like our code of conduct. Like I'll say like CLP compared to almost every organization that I've worked with has a very rigid and very like strict code of conduct. And like I will say that aspects of that are influenced by like Islam to me. Like I know like not everyone in the organization is Muslim. I think almost everybody's not. But there's aspects of like personal discipline, aspects of like, what it means to like have proper relationships with the people around you, what it means to like constantly challenge yourself to be like the best possible version of yourself that you can be, and to struggle against like your more like animalistic instincts and things like that. Like that really did work their way into the way CLP is like organized. I think that's something that's like resonated with people coming into CLP, is like that like we as a collective expect the best out of ourselves, and we expect you to also expect the best out of yourself. And that was like I think a huge kind of like transformation of CLP's political ideology. Like when we started, it was like working out as ableist was like something that you would hear in like one of our internal reading groups, and like now like we like all talk about fitness and what we're going to do to get ourselves like our bodies in the best possible condition to fight imperialism and to be there for our communities and stuff. So I think like we've like in the last 5 years, like we've absorbed a lot more influences from like the Islamic resistance movements in the Middle East. I think is like a huge influence on CLP, and you'll see a lot of that like in our social media presence and in our politics. In addition to like other indigenous like resistance movements that like we've studied like both in the Americas and in like the quote unquote old world. Um, as well as like influence from like Pan-Africanist thinkers like Nkrumah and stuff. So I think like all those things kind of like came together, and it's a process that's like ongoing still to this day. Like there's still more people in CLP studying these books, bringing new ideas to the organization, and pushing our like political line forward. It's a process that will, the moment CLP's political ideology stops changing, that's the moment the organization will die. And so that's a process that we know has to continue.
Yeah, definitely. I know just thinking of like when I joined CLP and I go to meetings, like a check-in question would be like, "Oh, which face are you feeling like today?" and have like different like expressions. And then now we're like, "Oh, like how are your goals going this year, like mid-year, and like all checking in and like making sure that we're committed to things that we've said we want to do like earlier in the year, which I think is really great. Yeah, I definitely think discipline is like a huge thing that has changed with our political ideology. Um, and yeah, just more reading too. Like you can see on our Instagram, we have like a lot of reading recommendations. Those are just like some of them are texts that we read together, but most of them are like from organizers dedicating their own personal time in their own personal study. So you can kind of see how kind of like diverse CLP is and like what people's interests are. Like we're not all just studying like the same thing too, which I think does help. But we all are like backed by the same like political ideology of scientific socialism. And yeah, you can see that through
Yeah.
our presence in the Bay Area and our presence online as well. So yeah, that was like pretty much all the questions about the formation of CLP. I just wanted to tie it back into like what we're doing now. So I think y'all can probably talk about what we're doing in San Francisco.
Yeah, so currently we are running a Blood in My Eye by George Jackson reading group at the Black and Brown Social Club on Sundays, 1 to 3 p.m. We are also doing a youth medic program, teaching the youth street medicine, primarily right now focusing on working at the Dolores Hill Bomb. I don't know, Rafiq, if you want to talk a little bit about that. I know you've been more involved with support there.
Yeah, so I think like I'll keep it short, but the background I'd like to understand is like you have this like yearly skating event that happens at Dolores Park. A bunch of kids, both like local kids and kids from around the Bay will come in and, basically bomb down the hill on their like skateboards.
And
Um,
for those who don't know what bombing down a hill is, it's riding your skateboard down the hill.
yeah, you go fast, you crash, you get hurt. I used to do it when I was like in college and I like hurt myself pretty bad at one point. But anyway, so like 2 years ago, the SFPD basically went in on these kids and like brutalized them, arrested them, like held them for
Yeah,
hours,
corralled them.
corralled them. And it was like this huge kind of community backlash. It's like, you guys could be the voices we heard from the community was like, you guys could be helping the kids do this in a safer way. You could be offering like medical support. You could be doing all these things, but instead you chose like repression and violence. And there's already like in the Mission District a very tenuous relationship with like SFPD because of like police killings that have like targeted like members of our community over the last 15, 20 years. um and a lot of groups active like around this issue of like police violence. And it's also like most people listening probably know this, but it's like also like one of the neighborhoods that's really at this like battle of like in the center of this like battle of gentrification that's like unfolding in San Francisco, or has been unfolding for quite some time now. So last year we went out and like provided medical support. Like this is a little bit more like quote unquote underground, but we worked with like local groups to provide like medical support. And we're like, okay, how can we build on this? How can we pull in members of the community, like these kids who are skaters, and like pull them into a program where they're building political skills and like practical skills. So we've been doing trainings at the park. We've been like supplementing that with some political education. One of our members who's running the program is actually like an ER nurse or an ICU nurse. And so we've kind of created this like this like cadre of like youth medics, and we're hoping after the hill bomb to continue to like build with these kids and these young people, and hopefully create like more revolutionaries and like create this like resource for the community where whether it's a protest, whether it's like a community event, like we have people who can engage in the type of like this type of like community service with the skills that they've picked up learning from CLP and operating as a part of CLP. The other thing I'll mention, like kind of about San Francisco in general, is like, we engaged in a pretty long period of what we call like social investigation, and that's building connections in the community, like meeting people, organizing around different efforts that are happening in the city, and just understanding like what the landscape is. Out of our like founding group in San Francisco, like one of our members is like from the Mission and grew up there, and the others of us are from like other parts of California or from the other parts of the Bay. Um, like Danielle and I. And so like learning the landscape out there in like the city is like a lot different than Oakland even. There's like major change like differences that we've realized as an organization that makes organizing like much different there. And so we took part in like, shout out to Equipto and Mama Christina, who have been like pillars of the organizing community out in the Mission for a very long time. Like if y'all haven't heard about the Frisco Five, like definitely go look up the Frisco Five and understand like how they've been advocating against like police violence in the neighborhood for a long time. And so starting to like support some of their organizing efforts, like she was on a hunger strike to defend the right of nonprofit workers, like to protest against the policies of their bosses. And so like building that relationship, like we did things like school supply drives and just started to get CLP's name out in the neighborhood a little bit more. And we're hoping like in the fall to start our launch a tutoring program. And probably by the time this episode is posted, there will be a sign up form on our bio to get involved in our tutoring program. So definitely like gonna shout that out and ask anybody within a background in education or tutoring to sign up for that. And then also we have in our East Bay, like we have our Chinatown distribution program, which I think is like now the longest running regular program in CLP's history. And I know Silvia, like you are one of the people that manages that program, so I won't take too many words out of your mouth. But those are sort of the active programs CLP has, in addition to like a lot of different reading groups and panels and like political education, in addition to like some of the more material programs.
Yeah, definitely. Our Chinatown program started in April 2023. So it's a little over 2 years old now. And we deliver 240 groceries to elderly Chinese folks in Oakland, Chinatown, to their door at like the living facility that they live in. And that's every month, the third Saturday. And we also have a bagging the third Friday. So if you're in the area, you can fill out our Get Involved form in our link tree to get involved with that and come to our orientations for volunteers. And also in the East Bay, not sure when this will be posted, but I'm assuming the reading group would have already started. We are having a reading group on Black Against Empire, kind of goes over the history of the Black Panther Party. And it is from June 22nd to August 3rd, every Sunday from 1 to 3 at Firehouse, which is 815 Alice Street. You can see the post on our Instagram. But yeah, CLP is looking to build more programs like our mission tutor program that's in the works, as well as more on the East Bay. We are hoping to launch a political prisoners of war letter writing night. The main issue with CLP right now, I think, is having a space. So that's where I can kind of segue into supporting our Give Butter. So we have a Give Butter to try to secure a headquarters for CLP in the East Bay, hopefully in Oakland, maybe Berkeley, depending on where there's availability and pricing and everything. But yeah, please donate to our Give Butter. Donate to our Venmo if you're unable to donate to Give Butter for whatever reason. And we also have a Buymeacoffee. So our Buymeacoffee is mostly allocated to supporting our programs, mainly for East Bay, because we deliver so many groceries. Like we have to rent a U-Haul every month. So the Buymeacoffee will support us renting a U-Haul and to continue that program. And also just other things that we mentioned today in this podcast was reading We Are Our Own Liberators by Jalil Muntaqim, specifically the For Linen Handbook section. Maybe read that first, but definitely read the whole entire book. And we'll put that in the show notes as well, and a link to a PDF of it and a link to purchase it to support Jalil. Is there anything, Danielle or Rafiq, you wanted to say to close out today? Thank you so much for coming on the pod.
Yeah, I'll say, if you're listening to this podcast, like get involved, get organized. You know, the phrase "we are our own liberators" means that like all of us have a responsibility to contribute to our liberation. And so if your politics is still very much like locked in the phrase of like liking things on Instagram, sharing infographics, like, complaining to your friends about capitalism over brunch mimosas, like get away from that, get involved in your community. It's the best decision you could possibly make for your own like family and community's health and safety. And also like that sense of revolutionary optimism you get by organizing is the shine. It's like the lighthouse that gets you through tough times, myself, I've been like in my community, like there's been a lot of despair recently over this like Iran Israel war, this like Iran Zionist entity war. And that sense of revolutionary optimism is so present in like the people of Iran. And it's something that I've like struggled to really push in my own family and community. So I just wanted to mention like there's tough times ahead. There's a lot that's going to go wrong. Things are going to continue to deteriorate here in the belly of the beast and get worse. And, fascism will become more overt. And if you're not organizing, if you're not in touch with people who have these types of politics and are building something that like is going to pay dividends in the future for changing society, it's easy to lose hope. It's easy to fall into despair. And I just want to encourage people to get involved in a revolutionary organization. If you're in the Bay, tap in with CLP, tap in with people's programs. If you're not in the Bay, look for organizations that have true anti-imperialist, pro-resistance politics, and give your life to the revolution. It's really an immoral imperative for all of us.
And that was great. I don't really have too much to add other than I agree with Rafiq about the revolutionary optimism. I have a little meme on my phone that helps me feel that, where it says, I study, organize, and am carried forward by a great feeling of love and revolutionary optimism. I know we have a world to win. So kind of look at that every day to remind myself why I do this, why I'm in CLP, and why it's so important for us to just like keep it pushing.
All right. Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for listening.